Good afternoon. I'm Ralph Nelson and reading from the book American Dialogue. In this book, Joseph Ellis treats history as a continuing conversation between voices from the past and us in the present. Ellis takes us through 4 issues that the founders wrestled with in 1787 as they wrote our founding document, the U.S. Constitution, and throughout their political lives. For each issue, he examines the views and the life of one founder. All were presidents of the United States. Then he discusses how we are coping with that same issue today. The issues are race relations with Thomas Jefferson, financial inequality with John Adams, mutability of the law with James Madison, and relations with other nations with George Washington. I shall read extracts from one section on income inequality. I hope that this presentation will encourage you to read the whole book. Coming to terms with John Adams has always been a complicated negotiation. His impeccable revolutionary credentials mark him as a candidate for the top tier within that band of brothers we capitalize and mythologize as founding fathers. Indeed, a plausible case could be made that no American founder other than George Washington did more to make the American Revolution happen. But as Adams predicted, there is no Adams Memorial on the Mall or tidal basin, and his profile is not to be found on Mount Rushmore or our common currency. Somehow he seems fated to be the prodigal son of the revolutionary generation, the founder almost determined to undermine our iconic expectations, most predisposed to wander off script in ways that violated the central storyline that posterity wanted to hear. Part of what we might call the Adams problem is the sheer volume and unfiltered candor of his correspondence, which replicated the unburdened, take no prisoners character of his conversation. Quote, "Have mercy on me, posterity," he shouted near the end, continuing, "if you should ever see any of my letters." Unlike Washington, who instructed his wife to burn all their correspondence, Adams and his beloved Abigail kept and preserved their nearly 1,200 letters. And while Washington's diary dutifully recorded the weather, Adams' diary was often about the storms surging throughout his own soul. My point, which will be the burden of the following pages, is that the recently recovered relevance of Adams should extend beyond our newfound appreciation of his bracingly honest, all too human personality. Adams has become relevant for our times because he is the only prominent founder who anticipated the emergence of an embellished version of economic equality in American society. A prophecy that seemed so bizarre and thoroughly un-American, most of his contemporaries, that it served as evidence for the charge that he had obviously lost his mind. Rather than go back and search through Adams' long career to find the origins and eventual evolution of his distinctive way of thinking about what he called the illusion of equality, let us begin at the end, where we can encounter the core idea fully formed in his correspondence with Thomas Jefferson. That makes logical, if not chronological sense, since Jefferson epitomized the mentality that Adams regarded as illusory. So the dialogue of their twilight years, which has justifiably achieved classic status as the literary capstone of the founding era, contains the clearest expression of the underlying issues at stake. It also helps that Adams was an inherently dialectical thinker who mobilized his intellectual arsenal most fully in opposition. In this case, in response to Jefferson's embodiment of the received wisdom of the day. Adams was throwing down the gauntlet to Jefferson when he observed, "You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other." Between 1812 In 1826, Adams and Jefferson exchanged 158 letters, of which Adams wrote 109. Behind in line. Okay. The fact that they died on the same day in 1826, which happened to be July 4th, and the 50th anniversary of American independence, has always seemed too providential to be true, the kind of event that no novelist would have dared make up. The correspondence also casts an elegiac spell as we watch two elder statesmen playing the role of philosopher king, looking back from very different perspectives at the history they had made, and that in turn made them. It is clear from the start that there are two fundamentally different temperaments at work. Jefferson, more controlled, self-protected, less invested. Adams, more candid, flamboyant, and expressive, compelled to search out that edgy borders of their famous friendship. A video of their dialogue would have Jefferson standing erect, arms folded against his chest, in his customary posture of stately composure, with Adams pacing back and forth in frenzied animation, periodically stopping to pull at Jefferson's lapels, incapable of holding a pose. More relevantly, the Adams critique of Jefferson operates at a much deeper level of intellectual and ideological sophistication, involving nothing less than a wholesale rejection of what he regarded as the following illusions of the French Enlightenment: the unfounded belief in the preternatural wisdom of the people, the naive assumption that human beings are inherently rational creatures, and the romantic conviction that American society was immune to the class divisions so prevalent in Europe. Political differences between Adams and Jefferson are too multifaceted to be captured in the conventional categories of liberal and conservative. What we must negotiate is the distinction between a realist and an idealist, a pessimist and an optimist, a skeptic and a believer. Both men were rock-ribbed American patriots, though diametrically at odds over the likely shape of America's future. Jefferson used the word ideology in one of his letters. Adams remembered that it was when he and Jefferson were serving together in pre-revolutionary Paris that he had first encountered this strange term. They were both listening to French philosophers spin their utopian webs in what Adams called the school of folly. It now suddenly dawned on him that Jefferson's entire style of political thinking was much indebted to the invention of the word ideology. That this was very much a French way of thinking about politics, a systematic way of going wrong with confidence by confusing what one could imagine, human perfectibility, social equality, with what was possible in the world. He was essentially accusing Jefferson of embracing attractive dreams, molding them into an ideology, then reading the world through that tilted prism. One dimension of Jefferson's dream that Adams singled out for special ridicule, a central delusion in the school of folly, was his enshrinement of the people, or the mighty wave of public opinion, as the infallible source of political wisdom. The fundamental article of my political creeds, Adams declared quite defiantly, is that despotism or unlimited sovereignty or absolute power is the same in a popular assembly as an aristocratic council, an oligarchic junto, or a single emperor. Adams realized that this creedal statement was heretical in Jefferson's political universe, where it was inherently impossible for the people to behave despotically. Adams was attempting to disabuse his old friend of the same kind of magical thinking that had permitted medieval theologians to conjure up miracles. There was, in fact, no surefire source of political omniscience on this side of heaven, and making the people into just such a heavenly creature was a preposterous perturbation of an alluring illusion about kings long since discredited by Jefferson himself in his indictment of King George III in the Declaration of Independence. Indeed, if you wanted to know where such illusions about the infallibility of the people led, you only needed to follow the blood-stained trail of the French Revolution, which moved through the massacres at the guillotine to its inevitably despotic destination in Napoleon. Jefferson wrote additional letters. The next time, the loaded term was Astos, Aristoi, Greek were the best. And once again, it was Jefferson who inadvertently triggered another Adams eruption, this time generating a spirited dialogue between the two patriarchs that has justifiably achieved the status of a classic conversation about the meaning of equality for the revolutionary generation. Jefferson distinguished between the natural aristocracy based on virtue and talent and the pseudo-aristocracy founded on wealth and birth without either virtue or talents. The Adams strictures against aristocracy, he suggested, were really warnings about the pseudo-aristocracy, which Jefferson agreed was a mischievous ingredient in government, and provision should be made to prevent its ascendancy. Given the favorable laws and the abundant land of America, it was reasonable to expect that rank and birth and tinsel aristocracy will finally shrink into insignificance. The result should be a roughly equal middle-class society, blissfully bereft of European gaps in wealth and embedded social distinction. Adams cautioned Jefferson, "Your distinction between natural and artificial aristocracy does not appear to me well-founded." He moved from caustic condescension to playful jest. "Now, my friend, who are the aristotle? Philosophy may answer the wise and the good, but the world, mankind, have by their practice always preferred the rich and beautiful and well-born. Even philosophers," he chided, "when marrying their children, prefer the rich and handsome and the well-descended to the wise and the good." There were 5 pillars of aristocracy, he concluded: beauty, wealth, birth, genius, and virtue. The debate over the Aristoi, in fact, proved to be the last extended argument in the correspondence between Jefferson and Adams. As both patriarchs, even the ever-combustible Adams, chose to subordinate their political and intellectual differences to the recovery of their famous friendship. In 1818, when asked by a curious observer how he felt about that man from Monticello, Adams embraced a policy of total amnesty. "He is the last and oldest of my confidential bosom friends," he explained. "Let party faction and politics will." While he prepared to acknowledge that history had confirmed the Adams prediction about the French Revolution, Jefferson felt no need to make any conciliatory statement about the Adams prediction that social and economic inequality would afflict the American Republic. Indeed, for the next half-century, as long as the American economy remained primarily agrarian and Western land remained available for settlement, it also remained plausible to speak of a Jeffersonian America in which his egalitarian vision retained a measure of credibility. The history that would eventually confirm the Adams assessment had not yet happened. It so happened that at the same time he was writing to Jefferson, Washington received a 600-page manuscript entitled An Inquiry into the Principles and Policies of the Government of the United States. The author was John Taylor, a disciple of Jefferson, who had served in the Senate while Adams was vice president. Quote, Taylor was an eternal talker, Adams recalled, continuing, the greatest talker I ever knew, excepting George III. Apparently, Taylor had been spending his retirement on his plantation in the Carolinas, County, Virginia, reading and arguing with the volume work Adams had written in the 1780s under the title A Defense of Constitutional Government of the United States of America. Oh, I thought my books as well as myself were forgotten, Adams joked to Jefferson, continuing, quote, but behold, I am to become a great man in my expiring moments. The 32 letters Adams wrote to Taylor, in order, if you will, to defend his defense, became the full exposition of the system he had been unable to provide in his correspondence with Jefferson. Adams began with the assumption, by then broadly shared amongst political thinkers, the old revolutionary faith in public virtue was so prevalent in the 1770s was inadequate as a basis for political stability now that independence was won. The best republics will be virtuous, acknowledged. We may hazard a conjecture that the virtues have been the effect of the well-ordered Constitution rather than the cause. Most of his book defense was devoted to a description of just what such a well-ordered Constitution should look like. No surprise, the tripartite model that Adams had first proposed in his Thoughts on Governments, 1776, subsequently adopted in most of the states' constitutions, was the proper framework. It had an elected executive, a bicameral legislature, and an independent judiciary. It is wholly plausible for Taylor to assume that Adams disagreed with him about banks. Both men viewed the profits of bankers as inherently immoral, in part because they made huge amounts of money without doing any productive labor themselves, in part because they transferred wealth from the middling and poorer classes into the hands of the already rich. Adams' own opinion invariably was, quote, that there ought to be one bank in the United States and that a national bank with a branch in each state. This ought to have been a fundamental article in the Constitution, end quote. If Taylor's views on banks foreshadowed the Jacksonians and the populists, Adams' views of banking regulation anticipated the Federal Reserve Board of the Progressives and the banking regulations of the New Deal. This was all in keeping with his two rock-ribbed convictions. The new financial aristocracy, like all aristocracies throughout history, could not be killed, but must be controlled. The invisible hand of the marketplace required the visible hand of government to regulate its inevitable excesses. Another prime candidate for our scrutiny, is the marginalia in Adams's books. Even a cursory glance at his personal collection of about 3,000 volumes, currently in the Boston Public Library, reveals a treasure hoard of commentary that provides one of the clearest windows into his thinking as a political philosopher. Adams did not just read books. His only published account of the psychological roots of his system appeared in 1790 in a series of newspaper articles subsequently collected as a book entitled Discourses on Davila. If defense argued that the United States would create its own social and economic aristocracy, and thereby make a mockery of all Jefferson's presumptions of equality, Davila attempted to explain the motivation that drove American elite to acquire vast amounts of wealth in such ostentatious displays of superiority. Adams introduced the main theme of Davila with a fable. There was once an admirable young man who fell on hard times and became a pauper. He and his faithful dog were seen begging for food, which the young man always shared with his dog. As he approached starvation, his friends urged him to stop sharing with his dog in order to avoid his own death. The pauper refused to do so, asking rhetorically, "Who will love me then?" This plaintive question, "Who will love me then?" is the key to the human heart, to the history of human life and manners, and to the rise and fall of empires. The bedrock human passion in the Adams scheme went deeper than the quest for wealth, which served only as a means to the ultimate goal, the need for attention and affection. As his tale of the starving pauper was designed to illustrate the deepest human drive, as his tale was designed to illustrate, the deepest human drive was the irrational need to be noticed and loved. As a result, the new American elite would be a moneyed aristocracy with an even more avaricious appetite to set themselves apart with flamboyant displays of excessive wealth in the form of extravagant estates, sumptuous dinner parties, and more material possessions than they could possibly need. But riches force the opinion on man that he is the object of the congratulation of others, Adams wrote. His imagination expands and his heart dilates at these charming illusions. His attachment to his possessions increases as fast as his desire to accumulate more, not for the purpose of utility, but from the desire of illustration. The new American aristocracy, then, would be simultaneously powerful but pathetic, for it was attempting to purchase affection, currency that would never fetch much in the only emotional exchange that mattered. Why do men affront heaven and earth to accumulate wealth, which will forever be useless to them? Adams asked rhetorically. It was because riches attract the attention, consideration, and congratulations of mankind. Adams believed that entrenched economic inequality would create a political oligarchy in America because that was the relentless pattern throughout European history. Adams' defiance on this issue made him the most ardent opponent in the revolutionary generation of the Jeffersonian vision of American exceptionalism, always poised to deploy. Adams is always ready to deploy impeccable revolutionary credentials whenever he encountered intimation of some special semi-sacred status for the American people, or government that levitated above history's lessons and limitations. In the Adams scheme, all societies produced aristocracies, and all aristocracies were motivated by the same elemental passion to distinguish themselves from their peers. Through the primal urge assumed different shapes in different although the primal urge assumed different states in different historical contexts. His prognosis for the American future was a plutocratic aristocracy that distinguished itself by accumulating wealth, accurately anticipating the captains of industry that dominated the Gilded Age. His own generation, on the other hand, had sought distinction by pursuing fame rather than fortune, a higher standard in Adam's pecking order, though he was quick to insist that the quest for fame was just as irrational and ungovernable as other emotions. We must still remember, he cautioned, that this passion, though refined by the purest moral sentiments and intended to be governed by the best principles, passion still, and therefore, like all other human desires, unlimited and insatiable. Adams was acknowledging that his own patriotic motives, as well as those of his prominent peers, were rooted in unconscious regions of the soul that defied rational rules of conduct. Quality it is, he declared, continuing quote, what is it to us? What shall be said of us after we are dead? Or in Asia, Africa, or Europe while we are alive? There is no greater possible or imaginable delusion, yet the impulse is irresistible, unquote. Like some primordial instinct, the lust for fame was simply there, perhaps driven by the need to deny one's mortality by living on in the memory of posterity. Whatever its origin, Adams could testify that it had been the driving force in his life, perhaps first exposed as a very young man when he stood before the mirror to practice oratorical gestures in the style of Cicero. This did not mean that future generations would achieve distinction and recognition solely by accumulating wealth, the plutocratic aristocracy. In his hierarchy of human emotions, Adams ranked the quest for fame as more potent and enduring than merely material distinctions in the marketplace. He expected that a small percentage of the wealthiest Americans would seek a higher level of satisfaction by trading their private fortunes for public visibility in philanthropic ventures that offered the greatest promise of secular immortality. Adams anticipated the appearance of Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller during the first Gilded Age, as well as Warren Buffett and Bill Gates in ours. Because fame trumped fortune in the emotional sweepstakes, Adams predicted that wealth would never completely overwhelm commonwealth. There was, in effect, a built-in incentive implanted in the human personality that ensured a modest redistribution of wealth. Once you realize that equality is the exception, not the rule, in a capitalistic society, the question changes. Here we show the distribution of population on the left side and the population of money on the right side in the old days when we were ruled by kings who owned pretty much everything, along with the nobles, and the more modern day Enlightenment vision of things, the New Deal vision of things, in which the middle class owned a large portion of the population and tended to stabilize the government. Once you realize that equality is the exception, not the rule, in a capitalistic society, the question changes. Here's a contemporary view of difference between wealthier and less wealthy people. Photograph in Florida. Once you realize equality is the exception, not the rule, in a capitalistic society, the question changes. Ellis, it is not how can we free the marketplace from government regulation to increase productivity? It is, instead, how can we free ourselves from illusions about the market, free market, in order to assume a more equitable distribution of wealth? Not for nothing did Adams insist that Madam Massachusetts was more than a mere state, a commonwealth. Adams invites us to think about the meaning of the word republic, which comes from the Latin meaning public things. We still believe, as he did, that there is a public interest beyond the reach of markets and majorities of the moment. Are we a society composed of winners and losers, givers and takers, or is there some larger status we share more collectively as citizens? These are the questions he posed in his own cantankerous way for posterity, which is now, more than ever, us. And that is the end of the reading. And if you have questions or comments or even praise, you can call or email me listed in your directory.